Okay. What's your hand? That's it all. Yeah. Order, order. I call Deirdre Costigan to move the motion.
Thank you, Chair, and it is a pleasure to speak under your chairship today. I beg to move that this House has considered the motion on tackling rough sleeping. Chair, night after night in Ealing Southall, people bed down in front of the Quality Foods shop. There's a canopy that offers some shelter from rain, although it doesn't offer much protection from the biting cold. They sleep there all night, wrapped up in cardboard and ragged sleeping bags. Up the road in West Ealing, it's the same story. Indeed, in 2023, data shows that on any night in England, almost 4,000 people sleep rough. This is a 27% increase on the previous year. It's a daily tragedy for those homeless people, but of course it's also intimidating for people passing by, and it can't help but make our town centres less attractive for shoppers and for businesses. I recently met with Southall Community College, who are trying to offer a good learning environment to their students. But they say it's hard to do this when there are people sleeping under the college awnings every night and still there in the morning. The college are decent people, they want to help, but they don't know where to start. Help for Southall Street Homeless is a fantastic local charity which helps homeless people and those sleeping rough. I recently visited and saw the range of services they offer, from a hot meal to eye tests and a Bollywood movie on the big screen. But voluntary services are straining under the sheer weight of the people now sleeping rough. There was a brief respite during COVID when the Everyone In programme moved almost all rough sleepers into accommodation. But when the COVID crisis was over, the previous government squandered this opportunity. They refused to learn the lessons, and now the numbers are swiftly moving back to the pre-COVID record levels of rough sleeping. Now, some people might think rough sleeping is something you just can't fix, a problem that will always be there. But the last Labour government reduced rough sleeping by more than 2/3 in their first term. They did this by taking a cross-departmental approach, and I really welcome the new government's commitment to doing similar. I hope the Minister will be able to outline the timeline for a strategy on rough sleeping and clarify the departments involved in the new interministerial group. Chair, rough sleeping has a number of causes, including a chronic lack of affordable housing. This is not surprising, given the previous government presided over a net loss of 210,000 affordable homes over the last 10 years. I'm delighted this new government is investing in 1.5 million new homes, creating a new generation of social homes in particular. Our low-wage economy also reduces the affordability of housing, and up to now, renters could be kicked out without a reason. I very much welcome the new government's plan to make work pay, which will ban precarious zero-hours contracts and fire and rehire, and our Renters' Rights Act, which will ban Section 21 evictions, giving renters more rights. Many of those sleeping rough have mental health problems or substance misuse issues. Indeed, many of them have both. They need intensive support, but we know the NHS is in crisis. The Secretary of State has taken decisive action with a new 10-year plan, but I hope that the Minister will ensure that the needs of rough sleepers are taken into account when designing community mental health and addiction services that will help to reduce rough sleeping. But while we're taking steps to reduce rough sleeping by building new housing, improving renters' rights, making work pay and rebuilding our NHS, this is all being undermined by the previous government's broken immigration and asylum system, which is literally creating rough sleepers. In Ealing Southall, many of our rough sleepers are single men in their 60s, although they look even older from their time on the streets. They often come from India originally, and they don't speak much English, despite having lived here for many years. They may have worked in construction or catering and rented a home, but something went wrong in their lives. And when they went to look for help to avoid becoming homeless, they discovered they didn't have the correct visa. They get told they're no recourse to public funds, NRPF, and they can't access housing or welfare support. With no housing benefit or universal credit, some of them end up with no option except to sleep on the streets. In some way, their experience is similar to those affected by the Windrush scandal. They get asked for piles of evidence they didn't keep because they never knew there was a problem with their papers. There are now 3.3 million people in this country who have been told they have no recourse to public funds, a massive increase in people being denied access to basic services. But many of them do have the right to services. They just need help to track down paperwork and to make their case. But in a catch-22 situation, they aren't allowed to access help to prove their status. It is right that this government has taken on the staff to start assessing claims and ensuring those without a right to remain in this country are removed. But I hope the Minister will consider what can be done to offer advice and support to those people who do have a right to live in this country and that they don't end up homeless. Many of those with no recourse to public fund status who are sleeping rough have significant health issues, including heart disease and stroke, but they often can't access the care they need. Local authorities aren't aware of their duties under the Care Act, and they worry about spending money illegally. Added to that, of course, local authorities saw their funding decimated under the previous government, so there really isn't a lot of money to go around. I hope the new government will consider clarifying local authority responsibilities in this regard. There's also a growing problem with people coming out of the asylum system and ending up on the streets. The new government has finally got the system working again after the costly and ineffective gimmicks of the last government. But ironically, people who are assessed as being refugees and having the right to asylum in this country are being given no chance to make a life here. Under the previous government, people granted refugee status were getting as little as 7 days' notice to leave asylum accommodation, eventually changed to 28. But this is still far too short a time, especially as the local housing duty doesn't kick in for 56 days. I hope the government will give consideration to whether it would be sensible to better align these timeframes, whether local authorities can also be notified in advance, and whether improved support can be put in place so we end the frankly ludicrous situation where we are agreeing people are refugees and have a right to be here, but we are turning them out onto the streets. In Ealing Southall, we also have a significant number of EU nationals sleeping on the streets. For reasons that can include chaotic lives or mental health issues, they may not have submitted their settled status paperwork on time. Now they're stuck in limbo. It's easy to say they could go home, but as an immigrant myself, I understand how hard it might be to admit the streets of London weren't paved with gold, that you failed to make it. I hope the Minister will look at simplifying the EU settlement system, offering more advice and support, and a better assisted voluntary return system for those who would consider going home. A further issue I want to bring to the Minister's attention is the chilling impact of the previous government's right-to-rent legislation, which has meant landlords wrongly thinking they need to see a passport before they can rent to someone. Many people born and bred in this country don't have a passport, and this policy is only legitimising discrimination. So I do hope the Minister will consider the impact it is having on homelessness. And I'm afraid it's not just the asylum and immigration system that is adding to the numbers of those sleeping on our streets. 15% of prisoners were released into homelessness in 2023, and 4,100 people were released from hospital onto the streets. Now, we know money always helps, and I look forward to the government making provision for tackling rough sleeping in next week's budget. But we can make a huge difference to rough sleeping just by stopping policies that create homelessness in the first place. Chair, we all want to end rough sleeping, and the new government's focus on building affordable homes, making work pay, rebuilding the NHS and strengthening renters' rights will have an impact. But we will never solve the problem if the previous government's immigration and asylum system continues to be allowed to cause homelessness and rough sleeping. The system we inherited is creating destitution by its very design. And not only is this morally wrong, it's a false economy. It's just creating a bigger problem that costs us more to fix through acute services, and it's also impacting our town centres. I know the new government has made rough sleeping a priority and has committed to a cross-departmental approach. I hope the Minister will work with her colleagues in the Home Office, as well as in the Departments of Housing, Health, Justice and the DWP, to ensure those making up their bed on the street tonight won't have to wait much longer for help to rebuild their lives. Thank you, Chair.
The question is that this House has considered the matter of tackling rough sleeping. Jim Shannon.
First of all, a real pleasure to serve under your chairship, and thank you for that opportunity to do so. To the Honourable Lady for Ealing Southall, well done. From the Honourable Lady, when she's come in here from the very beginning, one of the key issues for the Honourable Lady has been the issue of homelessness, so it's a real pleasure to come along, as I said it would, and as others are here for the same purpose, to support the Honourable Lady in her quest for betterment for those who are homeless. Can also welcome the Minister to her place. It's a pleasure to see her there, and we look forward to her contribution. And also, in fairness to the Shadow Minister, who is a well-seasoned campaigner, will be able to put over the issues equally as well as much as we all can. So, as the Honourable Lady for Ealing Southall has set the scene so very well, it is always of great sadness, I think, to be fair, to hear the comments of other members regarding rough sleeping across the UK. The Honourable Lady said I'm not trying to pick the right words, Sir Christopher, almost a desperate scene for people who are homeless and what they go through. And there's a UK-wide issue, and all constituencies have been faced with this. I always like to, as I always do, Sir Christopher, give a Northern Ireland perspective, and while rough sleeping may not be as massive an issue in Northern Ireland as it is in other parts of the United Kingdom, indeed in the Honourable Lady's constituency, it is something we have to raise awareness with, and this debate today gives us that opportunity to do that. I will give some examples of where the issues have affected me in my constituency and those who respond, because I think, Mr Chairman, there's a collective responsibility upon us all, and all the government bodies and all the people who look after individuals who are homeless and rough sleep, because by doing so, then you can be better prepared to help and support them. Mr Chairman, to start with, there's almost a stigma around rough sleeping, that those who have no other choice in life have made incorrect, I say it very respectfully, incorrect decisions, maybe not by choice, but they find themselves in those circumstances where they are. And some cases may, as they do, where they look for solace in other things which don't give them solace, but indeed perhaps give them more heartache and more pain. And I think of substance abuse, not being able to get their lives back on track, a real journey where it's almost been like, Mr Chairman, been on a train and not able to get off. And for some people who rough sleep, that's a fact and reality for them. Well, that's simply not the case at all, of course. Rough sleeping can be due to a relationship breakdown, financial circumstances, availability of housing, and so on. I'm going to give a couple of examples of that. I'm going to give a couple of examples of those who respond and what they do. In 2023, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive released figures on rough sleeping. These figures, by their nature, won't be astronomical from a mathematical point of view, but they will tell the story of, in this case, 45 people who were rough sleeping, a 36.4% increase from 2022 when the figure was 33. And while that may not seem like much, it is 45 people who are homeless, who are rough sleeping and have nowhere to go. And in many cases, Mr Chairman, have no hope. And I suppose what I want to perhaps respond to in a small way, hopefully an effective way, say of those who step up. 45 of those individuals who require support and asked us to do better. 32 of those 45 were in Belfast, that's just up 15-20 miles from my own constituency, and a further 7 in Newry. Can I make a point of, again, for churches? I mentioned them really beforehand, the church groups. Sometimes these figures may not really reflect what's really happening. And why is that, Mr Chairman? That's because church groups and individuals and volunteers, we have street pastors in the major towns in my constituency who are well aware of what's going on. So I would probably want to thank them first of all for what they do, because they respond directly by meeting those people and have a direct contact, and it's very important the role that they play. So maybe the Minister, when to sum it up at the end, could perhaps maybe, we can't do it all ourselves, but we can do it with others. That's the point I want to try and make. So really, Minister, how can we work better with street pastors as an example? Church groups as well. Sometimes by the coming through the street pastors and the churches respond to those people who are homeless and are rough sleeping, and those people are probably, indeed I know they are looked after by the churches directly, where they find them accommodation, find them somewhere to sleep overnight. They give them a meal. They try to get them onto the benefit system again, where they need to be, where they've been off radar even. And the second group I want to refer to, Mr. Chairman, is the veterans. One of the veterans in my town in Newton Ards did an overnight sleep. He wanted to highlight the issue. I was glad I wasn't sleeping overnight as well, because I think when I get down into that wee tent, I could probably have difficulty trying to get back out again. But he did it overnight. And what was he doing? He was highlighting the issue of veterans, who I know there's so many veterans are under the radar and aren't able to perhaps maybe get the help that they need. So he highlighted that. So again, Minister, when it comes to the veterans, those people who rough sleep, who find that the horrors of what they've experienced in their in uniform, whether it be Iraq or even Northern Ireland, in many cases it would be in our case, but other parts of the world where they fought in uniform, and the nightmares of what they went through have affected them. So he did an overnight thing. I stayed along with him for the photograph and to speak to him and to tell the press what the object of the exercise was. So what are we doing for veterans, Minister? Again, very specific question. I can acknowledge that compared to other constituencies, we are fortunate that it doesn't have all that seemingly a great an impact, but there are still there. Northern Ireland does have a clear issue, and that's homelessness itself. I've lost count at the people and the families who come to my office looking for help, as they have no home for many reasons. Information backed up by the Simons community to take the rough sleeping just to the next stage of where we are.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and he makes a very eloquent speech on this matter regarding the importance of churches and street pastors and also veterans. Would he agree with me that many who are rough sleeping, it's as a result of mental health, and it's important that we really get to the crux of that problem within Northern Ireland and right across this United Kingdom, and ensure that our health service is providing the mental health services that are required to ensure that people feel there are other options.
Yeah. I thank my honourable friend, Honourable Lady, for Upper Band for that. Absolutely critical, and I know the Honourable Lady referred to that in her contribution at the beginning. And sure, Minister, while it's not directly your responsibility for mental health, I think there's a need of departments to work better together. So perhaps maybe in that reply you can give us some information about that. The Simon community revealed that in Northern Ireland there's 25,000 people who are experiencing, and I quote their words, hidden homelessness. To give an example, a young man in my office just a few months back, he had recently broken up with his wife, was asked to leave the family home. Relationships do break up. It's always sad when they do, but they are a reality of life. He continued to pay part of the mortgage as his two children were living at the home. He couldn't afford a private rental and was severely struggling to get rehomed on the housing executive list, quite simply because he's single, he's healthy, he's fit. Therefore, the points system doesn't enable him to be able to qualify for the homeless points or for the points that are needed to get property. What did he have to do? He had no choice but to sleep in the back of his work van, and that's what he did up until a few months later, when eventually I was able to be sorted. So there are so many single men and women out there likely to be on the waiting list for years before they get an opportunity to be rehomed. The official homeless statistics for Northern Ireland currently stand at 55,500 people, including 4,500 children. There are so many issues, Mr. Chairman, and the one prevalent is that the cost of private rentals are just astronomical. People are being asked to pay some £700-800 a month, and that's just not affordable on the wage bracket and wage median that they have in Northern Ireland. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, if we do not do more to tackle the homelessness crisis, the rough sleeping crisis, we will ultimately have more people who don't have a choice but to sleep rough, and that's where they're going. And the mental health issues, the veterans and their PTSD, the breakdown of family relationships, it all has a direct and collective impact. I remember, Mr. Chairman, and this is going to be my last comment, I still recall times of being in Belfast when I was walking through the centre of Belfast and seeing the sleeping bags along St Anne's Cathedral. It always very poignant for me to see that, because here we are in a bustling, busy town, nightlife, and there was people who had nothing on the footpath. So there's more we must do to support people, and that starts with addressing the housing crisis in the United Kingdom in terms of availability and affordability. And we need, Mr Chairman, to be putting more emphasis on building sustainable homes and apartments for those struggling. All those charities who do so much without ever asking for anything back, we're grateful to them. Thank you.
If nobody raises in their place, I'm not going to call anybody. Okay, Chris Vince.
Time that well. Thank you, Chair, for allowing me to speak in this debate. And I thank my honourable friend from Ealing Southall for securing this important debate. And I thank the previous speaker for his contribution. As I've mentioned this place before, I spent 2 years working for a homeless charity in my constituency of Harlow called Streets to Homes. My role was to locate people who have been reported as rough sleeping, help them find long-term secure tenancy, which means this is not only an issue that's very close to my heart, but hopefully one which I have relevant experience. I'm going to start by talking about some of the issues I've experienced, but also suggest a few solutions. I am pleased that the current Labour government has introduced 2 important bills. The Renters' Rights Bill and its ban on no-fault eviction, and the Employment Rights Bill, which will give greater security in work, and will at least address some of the causes in rough sleeping, but there's still much more to do. Firstly, we need to look at the causes of homelessness. Many of those people that I supported suffered from alcohol and drug addictions and all, to some extent, suffer from mental health issues, which are either responsible or caused by their homelessness. In Harlow, we had the added complications created by other councils of all political colours, housing the most vulnerable people in our borough, which meant if they were evicted from that accommodation, there was a limit to the amount of support that the local authority could give them. I would also add that national issues such as the cost of living crisis and the COVID pandemic had its impact on this issue. Although I recognise some of the work done by the previous government, including providing RSI funding, at this point I have to declare an interest because that partly funded my previous role, it did put the onus on local authorities who are already stretched to capacity. And I will point out that this does run out currently in spring 2025. I know that this Labour government will take the issues of rough sleeping seriously, and I thank the Minister for her time in this debate. This issue requires cross-departmental working to tackle it. The National Housing Federation has repeatedly called for more housing. However, part of the issue in Harlow is that accommodation which is categorised as supported doesn't actually provide sufficient support for those most vulnerable people who need it, which leads to issues with their tenancy and sometimes leads to them being evicted. It is also important that the official homeless count does not miss anyone out. Often women are missing from rough sleep accounts, and also we must ensure we include the hidden homeless. And my honourable gentleman who spoke earlier made a really good point about the hidden homeless issue. We used to refer to them as sofa surfers, people that had a sofa to stay on, so weren't officially rough sleeping, but actually were homeless and did need additional support. My honourable friend is right to say we should be proud of the record of the last Labour government in tackling this issue. And it falls upon the new Labour government to tackle the issue of increasing numbers of rough sleepers in the UK. I believe that with many of the issues we face, the only way to truly deal with them is to be proactive and tackle the root causes of homelessness and rough sleeping, as I set out earlier. Thank you, Chair.
Andrew Cooper.
Thank you, Chairman, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I want to start by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Ealing Southall, on securing and so ably leading this important debate on rough sleeping. Rough sleeping is an issue which blights our communities and ruins lives. Being forced to sleep on the streets has a devastating impact on every aspect of an individual's life. It's a frightening and isolating experience that no one should ever have to go through. But it's an issue that affects thousands of individuals every night who find themselves without a safe place to call home and facing the harsh realities of life on the streets. It's sometimes too easy to talk about this issue and reduce the problems that real people are facing to cold facts and statistics, which overlooks the real human tragedy that this problem causes. I won't do that, but I believe it's vitally important that we understand not only the problems associated with rough sleeping, but the underlying causes that perpetuate this crisis.
Will I give way on that point?
Yeah, of course.
I thank the honourable member for giving way on that point. This is such an important debate, and I thank the honourable member for Ealing Southall for raising it. We've had such a massive increase in rough sleeping, and it's so important, therefore, to get to the root, Mr Chair, of what actually causes rough sleeping. I declare an interest that until July I was Chief Executive of a homelessness charity in the North East, where we've seen homelessness and rough sleeping specifically spike over the last 14 years especially. We did do some research that found that 94% of people who are rough sleeping have experienced serious trauma, and so I wonder if my honourable friend would agree with me that we have to get to the absolute root of what causes rough sleeping, especially mental health, and that very often that is trauma. And I would ask if the Minister later in her remarks would also respond to that need, therefore, to have a trauma-informed approach when we address rough sleeping.
Thank you. I would agree with that. I think a trauma-informed approach would benefit a lot of areas of public life, and I bow to my honourable friend's greater experience in this area. I think rough sleeping is an intractable issue with many diverse and overlapping root causes, including a lack of affordable housing, unemployment, financial instability and family breakdown. But many individuals who find themselves sleeping on the streets are often battling complex challenges, such as untreated mental health issues, substance abuse and social isolation. And these challenges are often exacerbated by life on the streets and create a vicious cycle, making it extraordinarily difficult for individuals to transition back to stable living conditions. To effectively tackle the problem of rough sleeping, we must address these issues. First, we need to see the construction of more social housing. Secure, affordable and accessible housing is the foundation of a dignified life. It not only provides shelter, but also the stability necessary to seek employment, access healthcare and rebuild social connections. And that's why I was proud to stand on a manifesto that promised to build 1.5 million more homes over the next 5 years, including social housing, ensuring that everybody has a safe place to live. But building more secure and affordable housing is only part of the solution. It's not enough to simply provide shelter. And simply placing people with complex needs in housing and then leaving them to it is setting many of them up to fail. We must also look to introduce properly funded wraparound support services that address the holistic needs of those experiencing rough sleeping. And this includes providing personalised assistance for individuals struggling with drug and alcohol addiction and mental health issues. By investing in comprehensive support services such as these, we empower individuals to not only secure a tenancy, but also to maintain it, helping them break the cycle of homelessness, rebuild their lives, and foster greater independence and resilience. We urgently need to see action on this issue, and that's why I welcome the government's plan to introduce a new cross-government strategy to tackle the difficult problem of homelessness. I really hope this strategy will take a comprehensive approach to tackling the root causes of rough sleeping and get us back on track to ending homelessness, so we create a society where everyone has a safe and stable place to call home, coupled with the support they need to thrive.
Thank you so much. Congratulations to the member for Southall for securing this debate. It's very welcome. So Epsom Newell has proportionately one of the highest numbers of homeless households living in temporary accommodation in England, and it's in the top 7 boroughs outside of London, and that's currently costing the local council 1.6 million. That was last year. I just wondered if the honourable member agreed that the lack of social and affordable housing is contributing to the rise in rough sleeping, and this should be a priority for councils in their local plans. And I also wanted to concur with the many comments that have been said about veterans as defence spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats. I absolutely agree that veterans are massively affected by homelessness, and we absolutely must support them better. And I wondered if the honourable member agreed with that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Christopher, for your chairship, and may I thank the member from Ealing Southall for bringing this debate on tackling rough sleeping. Homelessness is a record high. We've heard about the tragic stories from people across their own constituencies sleeping rough every night. And this is up 74% since 2010, which is a shameful legacy of the Tories. Like much of the South East, my constituency is fighting a losing battle with capped housing allowance rates, ever-rising rents and a shortage of supported housing and single-person affordable housing. I recently met with a brilliant homeless charity in my constituency called Two Saints, and they're doing valuable work around temporary and supported accommodation for adults and young people and people with mental health problems. The visit really showed me some ideas of what action we could take to meaningfully reduce rough sleeping. Long-term funding is needed to urgently stem the reduction in public funds to address homelessness. For example, extending the Rough Sleeping Initiative funding beyond the spring would mean that we would provide more money to local authorities to be able to make further strategic plans and tailor rough sleeping services. This will prevent the number of rough sleepers spiralling out of control. Also tackling the issue of devolution of housing policy, leading to a divergence in policy by area. For example, Hampshire County Council intend to remove the non-statutory homeless support by March 2026, which will leave other councils picking up these services. This equals roughly £2 million a year removed from homeless services. And if others don't have the capacity to pick up this funding gap, over 1,000 people across Hampshire will lose valuable support and be back on the streets. This is just a snapshot of chaotic postcode lottery support based on the very confusing mix and level of government that currently exists in Britain. We must join up the dots on a national level to address this through a long-term, strategic, cross-departmental approach to tackling rough sleeping and homelessness. We could create a single fenced homelessness support fund for designated flexibility to adapt local and individual needs. I'm really pleased that I'm in a government that has an initiative committed to housing veterans, children leaving care and those fleeing domestic violence. I am also pleased, as my honourable gentleman was, of the government's Renters' Rights Bill and Employment's Rights Bill. And I am also pleased to see that this government is focusing on building more houses of all types and more social housing. But as part of this, we must have a proper focus on supported housing and single-person housing. 30% of households in Britain are now single-person, and our current home building does not reflect this, which allows for the rise in family homes being made into houses of multiple occupancy. We must build the right types of accommodation in the right places. And alongside this, we can unlock access to the private rental sector by immediately unfreezing and restoring LHAs to cover the lowest 30 percentile of our market rates. Morally and financially, ending homelessness makes sense. But we must be bold and take this opportunity to provide safe and suitable housing alongside diverse support services that wrap around those constituents that are the most vulnerable.
Tom Hayes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to my honourable friend for calling this debate. People sleeping rough often have important things in common. They often have several support needs, such as mental health, substance misuse, an offending history, physical disability, self-harm, learning disabilities, experience of domestic abuse, sex working, abuse, neglect and modern slavery, pretty much some of the worst things that a person can go through. But they also often don't get the entirety of the services and support that they need, when they need them, in the ways they need them. And frankly speaking, this is nobody's fault, certainly not the person sleeping rough. It's only the fault of the last Conservative government. And I say this with the immediate and direct experience of having run a mental health and domestic abuse charity for the 5 years before I was elected, of setting up and sitting on a homelessness alliance, of chairing a mental health partnership, of being a councillor for 10 years and a deputy leader in that time. And I can tell you that over the 14 years of a Conservative government, this problem has got worse and worse. And I just want to commend the people who are leading and working within our services, because they are the most amazing, caring, understanding, dedicated people. We've heard from some of those people who are now in Parliament. And I want to commend in Bournemouth East, the constituency I represent, BCHA, St Paul's Hostel, which is run by BCHA, Health Bus, YMCA Bournemouth, Dorset Health Watch, which has just produced a fantastic report into homelessness health, Homewards, represented by the Prince of Wales, With You, We Are Humans, the Citizens Advice Bureau across BCP, and also Shelter, which just goes to show the array of services available in my local area. But the services that they lead and the systems they contribute, they are being held back by forces beyond their control. Underfunding has forced services to narrow and narrow and narrow their focus year after year after year. And the result is that they are meeting a smaller set of needs. Services cannot wrap support around as many of the needs as they would have done in the past. Instead, somebody sleeping rough must engage with a larger set of services. No charity has wanted to narrow their focus, but left out of pocket, often subsidising contracts, they just could not carry on delivering services without enough funding. And the result is twofold. First, our third sector's ability to support clients and contribute to healthcare has been eroded year after year. And second, the people needing support who no longer fit the referral criteria for a service will end up being bounced from pillar to post. And people with a combination of issues will always be the exception to somebody's rule. People who are willing to engage may become distrustful of agencies and refuse services, and this is a particular problem when people sleeping rough may, because of their needs, have difficulties keeping appointments. When people are flying through revolving doors, increasingly distrustful of people and services, feeling let down, they may experience crises, and without the support they need, this will only set back their health and increase the cost of their own health, but to services that could wrap around them. Prevention is always cheaper and better than having to treat somebody's health. And the people working in these sectors, the people in Bournemouth East, know exactly what is going wrong. They know exactly what needs to happen, and they know exactly how things could be so much better. And they tell me what needs to happen. They're clear that we need sufficient funding to run the services that will meet the needs of rough sleepers. And what will this buy? First, it will mean we have enough caseworkers with the time to care, because a flexible approach is needed to engage people with multiple support needs who may slip through the net of services. People sleeping rough typically benefit from longer-term interactions, and we need to understand that the funding should be available for these longer-term interactions rather than short interventions. Second, we need funding models which appreciate that work can go at a slower pace to achieve useful outcomes, and that means having a system with the clarity and the time to achieve that clarity for the people working within it, but also the people accessing support. And thirdly, and this could not go ignored, caseworkers who are supporting people sleeping rough need to be at their posts in their organisations for a long period of time, uninterrupted, to develop relationships with the people they support, building trust. Because if they have to get out of bed worrying about if they can pay their bills, if they have to get out of bed worrying about their own mental health, they're not going to be able to provide support to the people who need them the most. And that means taking away the reasons caseworkers may leave the service. Not getting paid enough to survive, not being able to develop professionally with the training and new skills that they need, or having their resilience beaten down because they support too many people, their caseloads are too high, and the needs they're meeting are so many, so varied and so complex. I'm just going to close by saying that I very recently went to visit Bournemouth and Poole College at their Poole campus, and I was talking to the head, Phil Sales, and he told me about a chap who had been sleeping on the park grass beside the college campus, who every morning had been packing up his tent because he was sleeping rough to come into the college and to learn in that place. His relationship had broken down, he was unable to see his child, his life had fallen apart. But with the kindness and support of the college, with the kindness and support of services around him, he was able to start to get his life back on track, and he is now flying. That's one person in one campus of one college, in one town, in one part of our United Kingdom. There will be countless people across our country in similar situations. So I commend the government for moving forward with the endeavour for a cross-departmental long-term strategy. We have ended rough sleeping before during the pandemic. We can end it again. We just need the necessary political will, and we just need for the people who know what the solutions are to be listened to. Thank you.
Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Sir Christopher, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Ealing Southall for bringing what is genuinely a very important debate to this chamber. And I'd also like to congratulate the Honourable Members on all sides who have raised some important examples of homelessness and the real individual tragedies that people are facing. As Liberals, we have always prized freedom from poverty as our constitutional objective, both as the Liberal Party and as Liberal Democrats. And therefore, it's not surprising that the first piece of homelessness legislation, the Homeless Persons Act 1977, was pioneered by Liberal MP Stephen Ross. And before that, great Liberal legislation introduced the concept of council housing, which led to 500,000 homes, council houses being built in the ensuing years. Today, though, that duty for homeless people has been weakened and watered down time and again, and we see the heartbreaking result on our streets all too often. The Conservative government promised to end street homelessness by 2024, yet here we see rising numbers of people sleeping rough. Over 16,000 single households are assessed as rough sleeping in 23-24. That's almost a 15% increase over the previous year. And the crisis isn't just about rough sleeping. There are now over 117,000 households in temporary accommodation and 74,000 families with children in temporary accommodation. This is shocking and unacceptable in a civilised society, Sir Christopher. These figures reveal a failure to provide safe, permanent homes for those who need them. Rough sleeping, of course, is driven by several factors: relationship breakdown, benefit changes that push people into unaffordable housing all too often, poor mental or physical health, including substance dependence. And without proper housing, these problems worsen, leading to more people on our streets and more strain on public services. Organisations like ARC in Taunton, in my constituency, Sir Christopher, do great work, particularly working with veterans, whom we've heard about from several contributors to the debate today. But the government needs to provide the necessary funding if these services are going to continue. Under current plans, the government's funding for the Rough Sleeping Initiative is due to end in March next year, leaving many homeless services with a financial cliff edge all of their own to face. Can I urge, therefore, the Minister, in summing up, that funding is extended in the upcoming budget to prevent shocking numbers of rough sleepers that we've seen? I'd also like to urge the government to recognise the financial strain generally that local authorities are under and act to ensure they have sufficient resources to deliver the requirements of the Homeless Reduction Act and provide accommodation for survivors of domestic abuse as well going forward. And ultimately, however, we need long-term solutions, not temporary measures. And as set out in our manifesto, that's exactly what we would do. Exempt homeless people from the punitive shared accommodation rate, which means they simply cannot afford to get the housing that they need. Give local authorities the funding that they need to deliver and meet the requirements of the Homeless Reduction Act, as I said. A somewhere safe to stay new legal duty, giving people emergency accommodation and assessment of needs as of right if they are homeless and need it. Banning Section 21 evictions, which we're delighted to see the government moving forward on. But because you can't have housing first without having the houses first, Sir Christopher, we want to see the government build 150,000 new social and council rent homes per year. Homelessness and rough sleeping is not inevitable. It's time we built the homes and provided the services to bring it to an end. Thank you.
David Simmons.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship so soon after we previously were engaged on local government matters yesterday. And I add my congratulations to the member for Ealing Southall, a place I do know well as a constituency member of Parliament nearby as well, for bringing this debate and for the contributions which have illuminated not just some of the policy and political angles, but also the genuine complexity of the rough sleeping issue which we are here to debate. When we reflect on recent history, the measurement of rough sleeping across the United Kingdom commenced for the first time in 2010. The last Conservative government felt this was a very high priority and, as a consequence, moved from a situation where less than a quarter of local authorities measured at all the numbers of people rough sleeping in their area under the previous Labour government, to a measure where all local authorities were required to a standard methodology to count the numbers of rough sleepers and to indicate the composition of that population as well. That's fed into a number of policy initiatives over those years. And in that period of time, we saw a growth in the numbers of people recorded as rough sleeping on the streets from 2010 till 2017. And then with some ups and downs over that period, a reduction from the 2017 peak to the numbers that we see today, with a particularly low figure recorded during the era of the COVID pandemic, when the everyone in policy was rigorously pursued by local authorities across the country. I think it's clear, Sir Christopher, that this is not simply a matter of political will, and we do note that despite the high priority that Labour in opposition placed upon it, those areas with the highest increases in the numbers of rough sleepers on the streets were Labour-led local authorities, and those most effective at reducing those numbers were Conservative. And I see some shaking of heads, but Westminster, Camden, Bristol top the list, and consistently top the list, for having the highest numbers rough sleeping on the streets. But, Sir Christopher, we also need to note that around 46% of all those people sleeping rough are in London and the South East, and I think the member for Ealing Southall provided a very graphic description of what she has seen, one which is reflected in particular on the streets of our capital, and one which, as other members have acknowledged, also reflects a very complex set of issues that lead people to be sleeping rough. The issue of veterans in particular was a very high priority for the previous government, and I have to note the work of the former member for Plymouth Moorview in driving forward so-called Operation Fortitude, which set up a direct and guaranteed route out of rough sleeping for any veteran who required it, of course.
Thank you. Would he acknowledge that many of those Labour local authorities that he was just referencing are actually authorities in densely urban areas which tend, according to research into homelessness, to have larger numbers of homeless people? And would he also recognise that those are authorities which, like Conservative authorities, have been significantly starved of funding in recent years, to the point that council leaders, both Conservative and Labour, have been crying out for a relief from government? And would he also acknowledge that with the starvation of many of our public services, people who were sleeping rough are often people who could have got support earlier, but because they didn't, are now therefore having to sleep rough, and therefore this is the fault of the Conservative government?
Sir Christopher, it's not an excuse, and I think it's very clear when we look at the performance of local authorities in this respect, and in particular the effectiveness of the measures which many introduced following the Member for Harrow East's Homelessness Reduction Act, that the performance of local authorities that were good at everything demonstrated that they were also very good at reducing the numbers of people sleeping rough. And those with perhaps a more questionable performance standard didn't demonstrate that they could step up to the plate, despite being provided with additional resources to do that. But I think the seeking to make it a political point rather glosses over the fact, which again many members have highlighted, of the complexity of this. And I'll finish the point around veterans in particular. We know, according to the current snapshot, that around 3% of those sleeping rough are thought to be veterans of our armed forces. And providing a specific guarantee with a free phone number and an online portal, so that anybody in that situation could be found accommodation to meet their requirements immediately, was an important example of how that particular group can be addressed. It's also interesting to reflect that the snapshot data consistently shows that those sleeping rough tend to be older adults, aged over 26. They are overwhelmingly male, acknowledging the fact that female rough sleeping is sometimes hidden, and that there are very, very small numbers, in some years 0, recorded who are under the age of 18. And I think this goes to the complexity of the issues which have been highlighted by a number of members, that this is not simply a matter of a lack of supply. We know that the complexity around addiction, domestic violence, patterns of previous accommodation by local authorities that have ended with difficulties with landlords, issues of settled status or lack of settled status and immigration circumstances, all of those contribute to the very complex set of reasons why an individual who should be able to access help from a local authority, and like many members, I've sat through homelessness interviews with constituents who are seeking to get that help. To access that help can be incredibly difficult when a number of those complicating factors come together. So how is it to be tackled? Well, over the period 2010 to the most recent election, we saw a number of measures introduced. I referred to the Homelessness Reduction Act, which sought to give both additional duties and powers to local authorities to work with those who are at serious risk of becoming homeless, not just to avoid rough sleeping, but also to avoid them being placed in substandard temporary accommodation that didn't fully meet the needs of their household. Then, more recently, we saw the introduction of Ending Rough Sleeping for Good in 2022, which was a £2.4 billion funded multi-year programme aimed at bringing, as far as possible, to an end a situation where anybody was sleeping rough on the streets of our country. So it is clear that whilst that was not a matter of law, it was a very significant and important government programme. Many members participated very actively in the debates on that and brought their views to bear on shaping a programme which included the Rough Sleeping Action Programme, an additional 6,000 units of accommodation aimed at bringing people in off the streets. And so, Christopher, as we move to a conclusion, I'll just share some reflections certainly on my time in local government. One of the challenges with the snapshot that is taken, and it's begun to be something that's taken in a consistent way, so we have a reasonably good idea of at least the trends, if not the detail of the numbers who may be sleeping rough, is that that is a snapshot that's always taken place around the same period in autumn. And we know that the numbers of people sleeping rough in our country tend to be higher in the summer when the weather is better, and that those numbers decrease as winter comes on. And one of the major factors which the rough sleeping snapshot is not able readily to capture is the availability of temporary accommodation in night shelters and short-term shelters set up, for example, by churches and other charities and voluntary organisations, which we know, for those who may not have found assistance for whatever reason in the statutory sector, are incredibly important. And I know my own local authorities have contracts with local charities that open up those shelters when the weather begins to turn cold. They staff those, they provide beds, they provide heating, they provide food, they provide showers. And then in the spring, those services are unwound. And that means, of course, that some of those people are either back on the streets or, if that service is performed as we would hope it does, they've been found a pathway both into a job and into more permanent housing. But the consequence of that patchwork of provision still means that we don't always have a clear idea of the number of people who genuinely are in that situation because they have nowhere to go on that occasion, versus those who may have been booked accommodation by a local authority but have chosen instead, because of addiction typically, to be on the streets with others who share that same addiction rather than to use that accommodation, something which is frequently cited as a major issue when it comes to the operation of the Homelessness Reduction Act. So, Sir Christopher, it is very clear this is a complex issue. The numbers overall in our country are small and they are declining. But because those numbers... Sorry, I'll give way.
I just want to return to the point you were making, and I think you raised valid points about the street count as an approach to determine numbers of people sleeping rough. Would he therefore agree with me that perhaps over the last 14 years, the numbers of recorded sleeping rough are actually the tip of the iceberg, and as a consequence, the levels of vulnerability often in our urban areas are going to be far higher as a consequence?
So, Christopher, I think that reinforces the point that I was making, which is we've gone from a situation where under previous Labour government this wasn't counted at all. There was no serious effort to understand the numbers of people who were sleeping rough on our streets. And I know as a councillor, including someone who was for some of that period responsible for housing and social care, it was one of those major challenges that simply was put in the too hard to deal with box, of course.
Thank you to my honourable member for giving way. Whilst I accept what you're saying in terms of potentially the data wasn't gathered before, what I see in Yorkshire and the Humber that in the last 2 years has been since 2010, there's been a 134% increase in homelessness. Yeah. Would you not agree with me that the strategies that were put in place by the previous government haven't worked, and there is a need now to review that strategy and put the things in place like we've talked about under the new government, like having a home for veterans, like having places that people can actually go to as soon as they are in trouble and have the support that they require for their addiction and for their mental health?
Well, thank you, Sir Christopher. It's also very striking if we look at Yorkshire and the Humber that the biggest reduction in homelessness has been achieved by North Yorkshire, a Conservative-led unitary authority. And it's clear that local authorities, through both the Homelessness Reduction Act and the various powers and, of course, the resources brought to bear on this, including things like the rough sleeping and prevention grant, have been able to deploy those resources where they've done that efficiently and effectively. But I wouldn't wish, Sir Christopher, for this to become something which is purely seen as a matter of politics. The fact of the matter is that over many, many decades, rough sleeping has been an issue. It's something which we see recorded in our country going back centuries, not something that's merely happened in the last 14 years. And of course, the challenge for... Of course.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way on that point. Having, as I've already declared an interest to the chair, having been a chief executive of a homelessness charity for the last 8 years, would the honourable gentleman not agree, nevertheless, although homelessness has always been with us, that in the last 14 years it increased by over 140% between 2010 and 2018 and aggregated between 2010 and 2024 over 120%, and that it's clear that everyone in besides, where there was a dramatic reduction, there has been an ongoing and consistent increase in the problem of rough sleeping under the last government. And just on that last point about everyone in, would he not also agree with me that during everyone in, and I personally was part of that response, that was evidence of what government can do if it treats rough sleeping like a public health concern. But the lessons of that were not actually learned, and that we, since Everyone In finished, that we are now seeing it spike again in the last few years.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. I think it might be the last intervention I should take, given timing. Yes, okay. So I agree with some of the points that the honourable gentleman has raised. It's very clear that the evidence around Everyone In was positive, and the way in which that was done by individual local authorities varied enormously, because they tend to know their local population, their local situation much better than anybody in Whitehall ever would. And the flexibility that was introduced by the Everyone In policy, and that was then carried forward in the Rough Sleeping Action Programme, is intended to address that issue much more effectively. So whilst I don't deny the statistics show that following the success of Everyone In, there's been an increase, and then more recently a decrease in the numbers of people recorded in that snapshot as sleeping rough. I wouldn't agree with the honourable gentleman that there's been no attempt to learn lessons. In fact, I think when we reflect on both the debates we've all participated in Parliament, but also the non-legislative issues like the Ending Rough Sleeping for Good programme, which was specifically designed to implement the lessons of the Everyone In programme in a more long-term and sustained way. I think there's certainly no suggestion that it was a lack of attention or effort, but there's a question, of course, whether the outcomes fully reflect that. And let's consider then, Sir Christopher, what the asks of the opposition or the challenges from the opposition may be as the government reflects on this policy going forward. No recourse to public funds was introduced by the last Labour government following the expansion of the European Union and the decision that was then taken by that Labour government to increase the numbers of those countries from whom people could come under free movement to the UK ahead of that decision being implemented in other countries. And it was taken by that Labour government because they clearly had a concern about the public view of, well, public perception of people coming to the UK to access benefits. Now, we know that that's not the case. That is simply not a factor. But that is the reason why that last Labour government introduced that policy. And I know the member for West Ham has done a huge amount of work on this, both in opposition and is now looking at it as a minister at the Department of Work and Pensions, partly in order to consider whether those no recourse to public funds measures that were introduced in the 1990s are still best fit for the situation that we have today, but also reflecting on the fact that there's been, over that period, a very, very large increase in the population of our country. A significant number of those people coming to our country with no recourse to public funds conditions as part of, for example, working visas. And there is a question, which was under debate in the last government and which the new government will now have to consider, about whether that is most effectively applied to the extent that it should be, and how that should interact effectively with our immigration system. Because quite clearly, and I've experienced this myself, it manifests itself at a local level with people who may have come to the UK to work in an important public sector job, to fulfil vital services, who have, for whatever reason, fallen out of that job, who then, because of the no recourse for public funds condition, aren't able to access benefits and find themselves in great difficulty. And although, from Whitehall's perspective, that should act as a powerful disincentive to stay in the UK, the fact that we have legislation going back to the National Assistance Act of 1948 compelling local authorities to step in and provide varying packages of support, in particular if there are children in the household, to house people, despite the fact that they have no recourse to public funds condition, creates both significant local cost and significant complexity in working through those cases. So my asks to the government firstly are the continuation of Operation Fortitude. The 3% of rough sleepers who are calculated to be veterans have benefited enormously from having access to that. It's designed specifically for those who come from a military background, who may have either found it, for whatever reason, difficult to access statutory support, and it guarantees the provision of accommodation immediately through access to a free phone number or a website, allowing for people's different circumstances. That was funded, a very important programme implemented by the previous member for Plymouth Moorview, and I would like to see that if the government is to continue with it, that is welcome, and if they aren't, that an effective, appropriate and equivalent alternative is provided. On the rough sleeping initiative, I'd ask the government to continue to commit to that funding. So we know that that programme is underway at the moment. It is funded until the spring of next year. It's done a huge amount in supporting local authorities to bring about the reduction that we've seen in rough sleeping from the 2017 peak. And clearly, my ask to the government is that they either commit to continue the policy of the previous government and continue to bear down on rough sleeping, or that the government announces an equivalent programme which will bring about the same outcome. And finally, Sir Christopher, I would ask the government to acknowledge that what the rough sleeping snapshot shows is that this is an incredibly diverse and variable issue. Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole local authority has also reported a significant increase in the number of rough sleepers. And members of this House representing coastal towns, for example, have begun to describe that manifesting as an issue where previously it was seen as more of an inner-city urban matter. Now, we need to make sure that we have a really good handle on what is happening. So I would like to ask the Minister to commit to ensuring that when she updates the snapshot and when she looks at the guidance provided to local authorities about how that snapshot is counted, that we build on the effectiveness of the work that's been done since 2010 to really understand what's happening with rough sleeping for the first time in our country, and look to make it more sophisticated so that we can better capture, for example, rough sleeping households where there may be children who are often very reluctant to make themselves visible at all to statutory authorities, to ensure that women in particular who may be falling outside of that are more effectively captured, and that those under the 18 who may not be young children travelling with adults in a family but who may be on their own are better captured. And we know that that group very frequently is found to be sofa surfing rather than sleeping rough, but are still in a situation where they have nowhere permanent and safe to go. And they currently are not captured by the data because it simply isn't designed to achieve that. So with those asks, Sir Christopher, I close for the opposition.
Minister.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I want to begin by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Ealing Southall, for securing this very important debate on tackling rough sleeping. And I want to thank all colleagues for their excellent contribution and their insights, their expertise, and also the examples they've used of the great work that's being done in their constituencies and up and down the country, because this is a challenge that we've got to tackle collectively. Sir Christopher, homelessness and rough sleeping has skyrocketed in recent years. In England, as we've already heard, homelessness is now at record levels. In March this year, more than 117,000 households, including over 150 children, were living in temporary accommodation. What's more, last year, the number of people sleeping rough in England increased for the second year in a row and was 27% higher than the previous year. Nearly half of all people sleeping rough on a single night in autumn are in London and the South East. And in places like the London Borough of Ealing, as we've already heard, part of my honourable friend's constituency, the number of people sleeping rough on a single night increased by a staggering 121% between autumn 2022 and autumn 2023. These are not just numbers. Behind these, as we've heard from honourable members, the stories of people devastated by homelessness and rough sleeping, stories of people in need who weren't given the right mental health support, of vulnerable women sleeping rough on our streets, many of whom are survivors of domestic violence and abuse, and of families having to raise their children many miles away from schools and support networks. The scale of the challenge is huge, and this is sadly what we've inherited from the last government. And the scale of the response is going to need a cross-departmental approach. And while that's not easy, this government is absolutely committed to and determined to address the current high levels of homelessness and rough sleeping. We need to develop and deliver a set of long-term solutions. Otherwise, the danger is of a sticking plaster approach, which we've seen in the past. As my honourable friend, the member for Ealing Southall, pointed out, we have to make sure all parts of the government and the public sector work together with organisations in our local communities. And as we made clear in our manifesto, we will develop a new cross-government strategy working with mayors, councils and councils across the country to get us back on track to ending homelessness once and for all. The Deputy Prime Minister will chair a dedicated interministerial group bringing together ministers from across government to develop the long-term strategy. And I'm passionate about tackling this terrible injustice, and I want to work with colleagues across the House. And I'm delighted to see the level of interest and the expertise already shared with me today, but also in other discussions. And of course, it's vital we work with ministers across our government to tackle this challenge. And I've already started, as has the Deputy Prime Minister, to engage with ministerial colleagues across government. So, Christopher, it's an absolute scandal that so many people live without a roof over their heads, and that families with children are living without a permanent place to call home. I see this in my own constituency and in my visits to homelessness services, the devastation that homelessness causes on families and individuals. And it is unacceptable that people don't have a safe and decent, many of the people affected don't have a safe and decent place to call home. And that's why we've got to both take immediate action to address the immediate challenges as we look to this winter. And I know the government is providing support to local authorities, and I'm grateful for two agencies and different tiers of government for the work where they are doing. The consequences have already been highlighted, the scarring effects of physical and mental health challenges that people face, the long-term consequences on families, on children, on young people of homelessness, but also on rough sleeping if a member of a family ends up sleeping rough, which can happen to not only those who are materially disadvantaged, but it can happen to people from well-off backgrounds, because they can be escaping abuse, they can be escaping family, leaving home as a result of family breakdown and much else. And we all know of stories of the impact on people and how they end up becoming rough sleepers. Powerful stories of adversity caused by life events and shocks that those who end up sleeping rough don't have control over. The impact on children, Sir Christopher, who often are placed far away on homelessness and where temporary accommodation is concerned, far away from communities, disrupts their schooling, disrupts their life chances and opportunities. Too many children are spending years in temporary accommodation at a point in their lives when they need the space to play and develop, to eat nutritious food, to thrive and access education. Mothers are living in hotel rooms with their children, often sharing a bed with their older children, and do not have cooking facilities. The knock-on effect on that, on their health, on their wider needs is just horrific. The all-party parliamentary group on temporary accommodation reported a case where a mother was placed in temporary accommodation with both her children who have physical disabilities. She said some places were filthy with blood-stained walls where the welcome pack stipulated, quote, I quote, no weapons allowed. This is completely unacceptable. To turn this around, we have to tackle the root causes of homelessness and rough sleeping, not just its symptoms, putting in place lasting solutions. That's why we are bringing together ministers across government to develop the cross-departmental strategy and working in step with local councils, mayors, as well as the charity and community voluntary sectors. On the support that's being provided, while we develop that strategy, the £547 million Rough Sleeping Initiative, which began in April 2022 and runs until March 2025, will continue its support to up to 300 local authorities across England. This programme funds a range of vital services from accommodation, housing first and outreach staff to specialist services. These specialist services include physical and mental health, supporting to tackle physical and mental health challenges, and also are there to support people who have left the prison system. It also includes training to widen employment opportunities and immigration advice. The Rough Sleeping Drug and Alcohol Treatment Grant funds targeted services to improve drug and alcohol treatment and support to people who sleep rough or who are at risk of sleeping rough and have substance misuse needs. We are working closely with local authorities to understand the local pressures and will continue to support them.
We should give way on that point.
I give way.
Thank you very much for giving way. I appreciate it. In Doncaster East and the Isle of Axone, we have some amazing community groups who look to support through relationships and connectivity communities, particularly those people who are in those communities that live with or are post-addiction with alcohol and drugs. I just wonder if there is an opportunity as part of our future strategy to take the learning from things like the recovery games that happens every year in Hatfield, where many tens of thousands of people come along who have actually formerly lived with drug and alcohol abuse and know that there's a community out there that can support them and give them that determination and that resilience to thrive.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very keen, as I was saying earlier, to work with colleagues. And as part of, I've already indicated to officials that as part of our work across government, that we should make sure that members of Parliament have the opportunities to meet with me, to feed in their perspectives, but those insights, the powerful examples of what works, because unless we draw on that expertise and the direct experience of those who have faced rough sleeping and homelessness, as well as the organisations working closely with them, we're not going to be able to address the deep-rooted challenges. So I'm really looking forward to working with colleagues on that. Sir Christopher, beyond rough sleeping, honourable members will have seen from our manifesto our commitment overall to tackling homelessness, crime and domestic abuse and, of course, improving mental health. These are issues which make rough sleepers and others experience multiple disadvantage, and we've got to look at these issues that are systemic to ensure that we deal with those root causes. We need to make sure that services are coordinated that help people that they're able to help people in addressing their overlapping and interconnected problems. And despite coming repeatedly into contact with service providers and resources being invested, if it's not joined up, it can often mean that the multiple needs that an individual faces are not addressed. The Changing Futures programme was designed to support people experiencing multiple disadvantage, testing better ways of working by considering people's experiences and obstacles as a whole. Our programme in Northumbria supported a man called Brian. His life spiralled into crisis after two traumatic events in 2008 and between 2008 and 2022, his needs escalated. Over these 14 years, he had, Sir Christopher, 3,300 interactions with public services. But now, with the right help, he is turning his life around. In September, I had the opportunity, and this example goes to show that a lot of interventions and work can go in, but actually it can take a very long time and it can be very challenging. So we've got to look at how we streamline services and make sure that the interventions are effective and that we get the value for money for the individual. In September, I had the opportunity to visit one of the Changing Futures hubs in Greater Manchester. It was evident that a strong relationship is vital to ensuring that people receive the right support in the right time. And the beneficiaries I spoke to emphasised how important the trusted relationships are with staff as part of their recovery.
On that point?
I give way.
Thank the Minister for giving me that point, and again declaring an interest until recently the charity that I led had a Changing Futures hub based with it. And it's a simple point, but would you agree with me that government services, excellent though they can be, must orientate towards not treating people as issues, but trying to have the genuinely joined up approach across government as we've declared is going to be our strategy, and that ultimately we need to see people as people who have sometimes multiple and complex needs.
He makes an excellent point, and I absolutely agree with him, and that is the spirit in which we want to work and learn from the models that have been effective. And, you know, let's not forget, it's that when we look at the journey of those who've ended up as rough sleepers or ended up in facing homelessness, they are people who are part of our community. Yeah. They've often worked in public services. I met a woman who was a nurse and out of a series of shocks in her life, ended up sleeping rough. People who experience family breakdown that can then lead to them ending up sleeping rough. So we've got to make sure that services are focused on the individual who needs that support and work around that. And I know there are many great examples, including, of course, the previous Labour government, and it was mentioned earlier, the work that was done, the ambitious target that was set and achieved. And we also need to learn from the work that was done during the pandemic and build on what works. I'm very pragmatic about how we approach this agenda, because we are determined to take action and support people and tackle this challenge. Sir Christopher, what was striking about the example I was referring to with the Changing Futures programme is exactly these points about multi-agency working, about joining up, about focusing on the individual, giving them confidence, giving them that backup, having people assigned, providing mentoring, providing support, coaching, and the rest of it. And I know there are many great examples, including, of course, in our own respective constituencies, and I see this week in, week out, the heroic work they're doing. And the vital need is to make sure that they are we continue to help them and support them. More widely, Sir Christopher, we are taking action to tackle the root causes of homelessness. We are delivering the biggest increase in social and affordable house building in a generation, recognising the supply of housing is critical with the 1.5 million homes that we have committed to building over the next 5 years. We are committed, I'm grateful for the mention on abolishing of Section 21 no-fault evictions, preventing private renters from being exploited and discriminated against, and empowering people to challenge unreasonable increases. Funding, £450 million of third-round funding has been available for local authority housing funds to create 2,000 affordable homes for some of the most vulnerable families in society, supporting local authorities to obtain better quality temporary accommodation for homeless families, and will provide safe and suitable housing for those on the Afghan citizens resettlement scheme who have fled persecution. I also wanted to point to a project I visited called the Peony Project, focused on temporary accommodation within DPEL UK, a charity that works with adult women who are homeless, and it was really impressive and inspiring to see the work they're doing with vulnerable women, and I know there are many other powerful examples. I see that with the work that's being done by organisations in London and other parts of the country to support women. A good way to my honourable friend.
Thank you. As a former teacher, will the Minister ensure that during these discussions and consultations that youth provision and the housing of youth is also taken into account?
Absolutely. I hope very much that as part of the strategy that we develop, that we can bring in the different perspectives. And of course, we've got to, I mentioned from the outset, the consequences on children and young people, and of course children in care and accommodation for care leavers. This is a big agenda, and we need to make sure that these elements are built in, and I'm delighted to see the level of enthusiasm among colleagues, officials as well as government ministers, including in the Department for Education, wanting to really focus on this agenda as part of the strategy. So projects like that are critical, Sir Christopher, in supporting vulnerable women who have face particular challenges as rough sleepers. There were a number of other points that were made by colleagues in their speeches, powerful speeches, and I want to focus on those. I've already mentioned some of the interventions already announced by the government on the Renters' Rights Bill that was announced in September, on the 11th of September. We'll deliver on our commitment, as I mentioned, in making sure that there are that we transform the experience of private renters and provide them better support and protection. The government is clear that we also need to bring homes to a decent standard and has extended Awab's law to help achieve that. We know of many examples of people who are accommodated in poor quality accommodation, and there needs to be a step change in improving the quality of housing. The government's clear also that discriminatory treatment on the part of anyone carrying out right-to-rent checks is unlawful. The Home Office has published codes of practice on what landlords are expected to do and how to avoid discrimination. We have, my honourable friend raised the important issues in relation to the asylum system. We have inherited a total failure across the asylum system from the previous government. As the Home Secretary told the House on Monday, this included £700 million spent on a scheme that sent only 4 people to Rwanda voluntarily. We are determined to restore order to the asylum system so it operates swiftly, firmly and fairly. But we recognise the potential challenges that individuals granted asylum may face when they're transferring to accommodation and need accommodation in the mainstream wider society. So we have to act to make sure that there is a smooth transition, and I'm grateful for the points that my honourable friend and others have made. And I know local authorities, many others in the sector, have raised the issue around notice period as a real challenge in supporting people to move once their status has been determined, to avoid homelessness. And these are exactly the points we need to take into account working across government to look at how best to address them. Ensuring we do all we can to avoid people leaving the asylum system and into homelessness is something I have already started discussions with colleagues in the Home Office, and we will continue to do that. I'm running a bit out of time, so if you can make it very...
Very briefly. Integrated care boards are expected to have a dedicated focus on reducing inequalities in access to and outcomes from the healthcare of the populations they serve. Clearly, rough sleeping people are among those health inclusion populations that integrated care boards are supposed to have a dedicated focus on. Can the Minister talk a little about the importance of integrated care boards in supporting people sleeping rough to access GPs and also dentists?
He makes a really important point, and that's why the involvement of the Department for Health and other relevant departments is key as well. Not least because there are also issues around step-down care when people are leaving the healthcare system, whether it's a hospital or other services. So just to respond to the point around public funds, we are very keen to make sure we work across government with the Home Office on these issues. My honourable friend will be aware that on modern slavery there are women who end up, majority women end up being exploited and can end up sleeping rough. So it's a very important agenda. The Home Office has committed to hiring 200 additional staff to process cases. Thousands of vulnerable people will receive faster decisions on their cases so that they can move forward with their lives while making the process more efficient. These new employees are already being recruited and will be in their post in early 2020. 2025. We know that modern slavery is a huge issue. I've seen that through my own work and visits to organisations that are doing really inspirational work to protect those who've ended up being exploited in this way. On veterans, no one should have to leave the armed forces and sleep rough. I'm grateful to honourable members for raising this very important issue. They'll be aware that the Prime Minister made announcements during our Labour conference about our commitment to making changes to ensure that we provide the support that is crucial to them to ensure that they do not sleep rough and they get the support they need. There are a number of issues around domestic abuse and particularly in relation to women that has been made, and we recognise that there are particular issues around violence against women who are sleeping rough, and their experience is very different, and £9.2 million of funding is available for women-specific rough sleeping services. We will take action as part of the cross-departmental strategy to make sure that we continue to provide the appropriate support for women who've been sleeping rough. Just going back on veterans, over £8.5 million on the Reducing Veteran Homelessness Programme has been established, and that's part of that agenda to provide support to veterans. Supported housing is a big issue. I know it's been brought up in the speech by my honourable friend. We are taking action, building on the work that was done in the previous Parliament to improve the quality of supported housing through the Supported Housing Regulatory Oversight Act, which was supported across party by members, including in the party opposite. So there's more to say and do on that. This is a critical area. Honourable members and honourable friends will be aware that according to the National Housing Federation, we will need to have a further 170,000 supported housing units to deal with the needs by 2040. So with an ageing population and the existing need, this is a huge agenda. Sir Christopher, honourable members also raised the important role that charities and community organisations provide, and I commend them for the work they do. And also the honourable member for Strangford talked about the challenges in Northern Ireland and also some of the great examples of work. We are keen to learn from Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales on the good practices, along with city regions in England on how we tackle this issue. On trauma, local authorities have made great strides to provide trauma injury services, and we will look at what more we can do to support them. In conclusion, Mr. Christopher, this is a really important agenda. It requires comprehensive work across government, and it also requires the expertise and input of colleagues across the House and organisations that are at the front line who've done extraordinary work to protect people and support them. And I'm very much looking forward to working with colleagues as well as organisations out there to tackle this deeply damaging problem of rough sleeping and homelessness. Thank you.
Deirdre Costigan.
Thank you, Chair, for your excellent chairing of this debate, and also thank you to the many honourable members and friends for their contribution. I regret, however, that the opposition spokesperson completely failed to take responsibility for the more than doubling of rough sleeping under the previous government. He seemed to think it was more important to count rough sleepers rather than to do anything about them. And he failed to say anything at all about the almost 250,000 social homes that were lost under his government. However, I do appreciate his support on looking again at the no recourse to public funds designation and the massive expansion of that under the previous government to 3.3 million people. Thank you very much to the Minister for her response. I'm delighted that the new government is focusing on social housing, renters' rights, making work pay and rebuilding the NHS, and I very much appreciate the cross-departmental focus that she is bringing to this issue, and particularly the leadership from the Deputy Leader, who I think will bring the priority we need to rough sleeping. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the matter of tackling rough sleeping. As many have been say aye. Aye. Contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. We now move on to the next debate.